Welcome to Philosophy15. I'm Scott Aikin.
I'm Robert Talisse.
We're the authors of Why We Argue and How We Should, a guide to political disagreement. These are 15-minute, unscripted conversations about philosophy by two philosophy professors. And today we're going to talk about a new phenomenon, or a phenomenon that seems to be pressing on us in with a lot more urgency these days. And it's a phenomenon that we're going to start to call trumping.
Right, so maybe trumping the media or trumping the free press. Part of what we've seen recently is in a series of very, I think by all accounts, bizarre episodes are cases where the president of the country says something, or as often the case is, tweets something that is surprising, puzzling, arguably nonsensical, as in the case of a word that looks like a string of characters that don't add up to a word in English.
That's right, yeah.
Tweets that have words in quotation marks in inexplicable ways. So the phenomenon is, there is a pronouncement in one form of another from the President of the United States that is so puzzling or curious or weird or difficult to interpret that it instantly becomes the job of thousands of tens of thousands of people around the world who are professional journalists. It becomes their job to try to figure out what the pronouncement means, and thus, in order for this mass of people to fulfill their basic job duties, the conversation around the globe has to be about figuring out what
he's doing, what he means.
What was said, what was the meaning of what was said. And so the phenomenon that we're calling trumping, maybe trumping the media, is this phenomenon of, by means of a kind of, perhaps even a red herring, creating the conditions under which it becomes the job of the journalists who drive the media to talk about nonsense, to try to interpret nonsense, to try to have panels on CNN for hours on end at night trying to decipher what the president meant.
And spend time in press conferences with the press secretary defending or explaining or talking down reporters about it all. And so the list is the Kofefe tweet, that President Obama wiretapped Trump Tower.
Comey better hope that there aren't tapes.
Right. These, and then we also have the offensive tweets, right? And so the one that is the one that's pressing on us right now is the one about Micah Brzezinski and her facelift. All of these are ones that seem to have captured people's minds, and that so much time. So it looks like we have a sort of a set of intersecting features to this. One of them is just one that's familiar to folks that know our work, which is that this is a special instance of swamping.
Right.
And so the phenomenon of swamping is that one introduces a series of speech acts that, because they're controversial or because they're hard to interpret or because of the fact that you just have got the largest bullhorn, so it soaks up so much of the air, or it sucks up so much of the air in the room that there's no time or energy left for other discussions. And so as a consequence, what can happen is that you can use a certain series of tweets as cover for something else that one is doing, right? So there can be an important discussion that's left undone because of, you might say, epistemetric or intellectual, economic reasons. Where it's like we don't have enough
not
time.
the bandwidth.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
We don't have the time, the intellectual capacity to be able to handle all those discussions. So on the one hand, trumping is just a special instance of the swamping phenomenon, but it looks like there's something more significant to this. One of them is that it looks like they seem to function as a kind of indirect directive.
Right. And so, obviously Scott and I are still thinking through the phenomenon, right? And trying to think through the position that we want to take once we identify it. But we're accustomed to thinking of political propaganda. I mean, there are other kinds of propaganda, but we're accustomed to thinking of political propaganda as a series of strategies, or as the phenomena related to efforts to instill or incentivize or mandate opinion, right, or belief, right? That standard view of propaganda, sort of Orwellian kinds of views. So these are strategies for instilling beliefs or commitments of certain kinds with particular contents,
yes.
Right? So the Orwell, 1984 is about, in fact, a lot of Orwell's work, even the journalistic work, is about the ways in which belief and commitment gets instilled, despite even, what's in front of your nose, right, as he put it, right, despite what your own evidence. And so propaganda in that sort of what we might call a standard sense is familiar and terrifying and all the rest. But I'm worried that this is propaganda of a different kind. That maybe there's another set of phenomena that deserve to also be called propaganda, which has almost nothing to do with has almost nothing to do with the project of instilling belief and commitment, right? Rather, this style of propaganda is more aimed at controlling the topics of conversation, controlling the ledger of what gets covered in the newspapers, controlling the subjects of the panels on Anderson Cooper's show every night. That controlling what conversations are the news is a kind of propaganda, I guess, and a kind of manipulation of the professional and moral political norms of the entire profession of journalism. Because when the president says something, whatever it may be, by the way, the fact that the president has said it is news.
Right.
Whatever it is.
So the crucial thing is that one of the features is that because the president says it, it functions as a directive, right?
Right.
So that's the first feature. And so, but the
you
second
mean a directive
feature,
in the sense that it tells you what you have to pay attention to.
It tells you what you have to pay attention to, which is the president says it. And so in the exact same way in which, like, if a teacher says things in a classroom or something like that, these are things to attend to. It has to do with the kind of institutional role that the person is playing. Second, it has to do with the fact that the person is in a unique epistemic or a unique intellectual position with regards to many things. And so what the president says, it matters, right? The person's in charge of a lot of policy. The person knows more than we do about most of these sorts of things, or at least should. And as a consequence, that's the reason why they're newsmakers. We have a kind of confluence of that feature of the presidency, and then the fact that Donald Trump given the way that he has risen in the media, is being somebody who picks fights, somebody who says controversial things, someone who works hard to stay at the center of many discussions,
Conversations.
Yes, that's right. And you have these two features coming together, and it's not that they add together and it's a sort of a linear, right? It's that you don't get 1 and 1 and 2. It's that you get 1 and 1 and 4 whenever you put these two sorts of things together with Donald Trump. And so, for example, if the president of the United States, no matter who that was tweeting, it would be news. But if you have the fact that you combine that with the fact that you have somebody who is a controversy-seeking individual, that's going to be multiplied, not just added together. And the second part of it is that it's not just a problem with the news media; it's with us.
We're doing it right now.
Right. So we're at the very least, we're not trying to get to the bottom of what he meant by wiretapping, but we're at the very least one level up, which is that there's a kind of indirect control over our right. I mean, the point here is that we're not talking about issues. We're not talking about other philosophical things. We're talking about this. We're talking about this phenomenon, and it's taking up so much of our bandwidth and so much of our frustrations. And even if we don't want to be thinking about it, we're still thinking about it. And it's this control feature that's the objectionable part to it.
Well, it's especially objectionable in that so it's especially objectionable when you add to the mix the insight, the fact, as we should call it, that tens of thousands of people in the world work in a profession that requires them to talk about this.
Right.
You're not doing your job as a journalist. You are failing at your responsibilities as a journalist if this isn't figuring out how to understand the stupid thing that the president just tweeted. If you're not writing about that, talking to people about that, chasing down senators and representatives to figure out how they react to the thing the president said, if you're not doing those things, all driven by some puzzling, peculiar, seemingly nonsensical, out of left field tweet from the president, if you're not doing that, you're failing at your job.
And that's a very strange thing, especially given the fact that we see a senator walking in and out, and we want to be asking them, for example, about the health care bill, and instead they're asking them for their response to the latest tweet.
Yeah, the claim that some woman was bleeding from her face from having a bad
from having surgery.
Why is that a criticism of the person, by the way?
That's exactly it. Right.
Anyway, so it's puzzling on many levels, and disturbing on many levels. But I think that it's perhaps the most disturbing element of it is that it's hard to. I don't know. What do you want to tell the journalists to do? Ignore the president? When the president says something crazy, don't treat it as news.
Right.
Don't ask in the press briefings when you're allowed to ask questions and when you're allowed to bring cameras and recorders. Don't ask about, what did the president mean when he said this thing about Syria. So it seems there's no way out.
It's kind of an inverse of the emperor has no clothes phenomenon, right? Where it's like where everybody was supposed to be impressed and thought that there was something wrong with them if the emperor's walking around naked. Now everyone knows that he's naked, but the news can't. Now everyone just can't help but just say, we're going to go on and on about the emperor being naked. There are other things happening here in the kingdom. But we can't stop looking at the naked emperor.
Yeah, it's a kind of
emperor went out naked today.
You just kind of keep creating a crazier and crazier spectacle.
Right.
So that all of the democratic norms then push in the direction of following the spectacle.
Yes. Right.
And meanwhile, everything else is still happening.
And there's no reportage on it.
Or discussion, or deliberation, or engagement about any of it.
That's what makes it swamping then, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's also sort of a new, sort of strengthened version of what we might think of as sort of Platonic worries about democracy. that it is still about the spectacle. It's just the spectacle isn't the multicolored, candy store that's going to just attract your attention to all of the desire-fulfilling pieces of candy on the shelves.
Right. Sometimes the spectacle is the theater of the absurd.
Yeah, it's the Hathos. It's the it's the rotting corpse that you can't. It's the car wreck you can't look away from, and you keep adding wrecks to it.
Philosophy 15.
Thanks, folks.